let's go to my short presentation. If we're talking about working with inclusion and inclusion working with citizens, of course, there are many aspects and many areas when it comes to inclusion related to the human condition and human identity, and of course also working with citizens and citizen engagement touches upon a whole wider area than scientific research alone. But just as a very short introduction, here we have an example that I took from a report from the Flemish Knowledge Center on citizen science, just to address specifically in citizen science the matter of inclusion and representation there. And as you can see, there's this a bit of a typical a distribution there when it comes to age, when it comes to higher education, that you may or may not be familiar with. But in the text section of the report, we can see that it's the older, highly educated men that are usually participating. And in general, participants in citizen science projects, of course, it always depends of the specific case, but in general, they're usually not always representative for society. So just a introduction. That being said, today we're going to try to tackle these issues or give you some tools or some inspiration to work on inclusion in your projects in which you work with citizens. So as you may have seen in the invitation or in the announcements, this is the agenda for today. Again, we're very happy to have our three excellent speakers here, and then we have the Q&A section in the end. Also, this registration form had a mind of its own, and we weren't able to include some questions that we really would have loved to ask you. So if you don't mind, it's a very short questionnaire. Literally, it will only take you 3 minutes, but it will help us to gather your feedback, but also to get a bit of a better view on who's here today. So I'm going to show the QR code a few times during the session, but please, thank you in advance for filling in this very short questionnaire. So I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker to you, my dear colleague Carina Weekman, who's working at the Smith Research Group at our university in the Digital Inclusion and Citizen Engagement Unit, where she's the principal investigator for citizen science. She's currently finishing her PhD on the democratizing effects of citizen science, and she's going to talk to us about her work in the Urban Relief Project. So, Carina, feel free to share your screen.
Yeah, thank you, Floor. Okay, with that I will start. So good afternoon, everyone. I will present to you the Urban Relief Project, and more specifically how we developed an inclusive citizen science approach through the strategy blueprint. I'm first going to start with a bit of information about Urban Relief itself. So Urban Relief is a European research project that aims to innovate together for a just and green urban transition. It starts from 4 different challenges looking to urban areas around Europe, whereby we see that there is an increasing environmental stress coming from heat, air pollution, grey infrastructure, and so on. At the same time, we do see that there is an accentuated inequality, so that some groups in society have less access to green space and also don't benefit from it. Also, policymakers are being exposed to a challenge related to information and data processing of urban greening. And when they are developing new policies, they might lack some information still. And then when organizing citizen science projects, as Flora already mentioned, public participation is developing slowly, and when realized, it's most often with the archetypical profile. So Urban Relief wants to make a change related to these challenges, and we are doing that with 15 partners and 6 pilot cities. Next year will be the final year of the Urban Relief project. And here on the map, you can see our 6 cities from Dundee to Athens. We're focusing on 4 different themes related to urban greening. It's related to green space perception, urban trees, air quality, and heat stress. And we are monitoring these 4 themes through different technologies, mostly being sensors and mobile applications. Now diving deeper into the inclusivity aspects of the urban relief project, starting with a definition of what we mean with inclusive citizen science. So in urban relief, we try to create a strategy that provides a fair and welcoming environment for all citizens. So Floor already mentioned, related to the study of civil, that in Flanders there is an archetypical profile in citizen science. This is the type of profile that we would like to involve in urban relief. And at the end of the project, we would like to see a diversity and an equitable inclusion of diverse groups. For that, we defined 2 evaluation criteria, namely that in all 6 cities, there should be a minimum of 50% female participation and 30 to 40% socially vulnerable groups. Going a bit in depth about what we mean with vulnerability in urban relief. So when conducting citizen science projects, you most often use these terms related to inclusivity. Namely, you might want to target hard to reach groups, underrepresented groups, or vulnerable groups. So the focus in urban relief is on vulnerable groups who are defined by their vulnerability due to a specific harm or disadvantage they are facing. There might be a conceptual overlap related to underrepresented and hard to reach groups, but it may not always be the case. And then you have different types of vulnerabilities that you can focus upon, reaching from physical, economic, social, and environmental vulnerability. Since urban relief is focusing on environmental health hazards, our focus is on social vulnerability. And this concept is actually defined by 3 different elements. So it's the combination of being exposed to a certain harm, then your coping capacity, either to avoid, cope with, or adapt to it. And then the outcome is your sensitivity, so your welfare loss related to this particular environmental health hazard. And social vulnerability is mostly related to characteristics of an individual, a group, or society. For instance, it may be related to your age, your socioeconomic status, where you live, your social support, and your health. So in time, everyone might be socially vulnerable, depending on where you live. If you move to a certain region where you are more prone to flooding, for instance, it might change. It might also be related to your age and your physical condition. For instance, minors and older adults are more socially vulnerable. Then for urban relief, at the start of the project, we discussed this concept together with the pilot partners, and we pre-identified these vulnerable groups. So it's not an exhaustive list, but these groups are more likely to participate in urban relief. It are women, older adults, young children and adolescents, and so on. As you see from the list, it's mostly defined by personal characteristics, but it's also depending on where you live. So for instance, when you're living in gray areas, it's more likely that you are exposed to a certain harm from air pollution or high temperatures. So wrapping up our inclusivity aspect, what we want to reach with it is first to have at the end of the project a more diverse audience and not to have a biased profile. And secondly, it's to avoid epistemic injustice. So, or the other way around, we want to have those voices, needs, and knowledges from generally vulnerable groups and not only from dominant narratives. Now, how are we approaching that in urban relief? It's through a development of a strategy blueprint, and the blueprint looks as such. So it exists of 4 different phases. Each phase has some sub-phases, and for each phase there are some key consideration guiding questions and templates. It's actually a step-by-step approach that guides you throughout the process of your project on how to include inclusivity aspects in your project design. Not everything is mentioned here about the blueprint. It's just a smaller screenshot of it. So if you want to access the blueprint, you can click on the tiny URL or scan the QR code. I will now talk a bit more in depth about each phase, starting with the preparing for inclusion phase, which is the phase at the start of the project where you are reflecting about your challenge or your research team, and you are going to pre-identify your target groups. In the Urban Relief project, we gave some guiding questions to the cities. For instance, during brainstorms and co-creation workshops, we asked them to reflect about which groups in their city would be the first to suffer from air pollution and heat stress, which groups would be disproportionately impacted, or which group has the least capacity to avoid or to cope with pollution and heat stress. As already mentioned, it's not only reflecting about personal characteristics, but also in terms of geography. And with that, I give the example of Utrecht. They already have some data available on which we can build and combine with the data sets collected in Urban Relief. This particular example is coming from the Climate Effect Atlas. The map that you see here is plotting the city of Utrecht in different areas. And depending the color code, it reflects the level of income. So the dark blue is representing a high proportion of people with a low income. So here in the co-creation exercise or in the preparing for inclusion phase, we say to Utrecht to prioritize those neighborhoods with people with a lower income, because these areas are also more often correlated with heat stress data or less access to cool spaces. In this particular phase, we also offer templates or checklists, and one of them is a template for persona creation. So this is an example of the city of Athens, who completed or described personas related to city officials and city employees, because they are regarded as well as one of the target groups in the project, specifically those that are collecting garbage or are responsible for maintaining the green spaces. Moving on to the second phase, it's the planning for inclusion phase, which consists of the organize and design phase of the citizen science campaign itself. So here you're going to reflect about certain principles related to your citizen science campaign, as the scale of participation, deliberation, equality, the level of engagement, which type of tasks, through which technologies, and so on. So here we also gave some guidance to the cities related to several options that they can choose from. So as I mentioned already, when you're designing a citizen science campaign, you're reflecting about your participation, equality, and deliberation. And these are three principles that will come into challenge with one another, and you will have to face some trade-offs. So if you're opting for a large-scale campaign, you will organize an open call for invitation. You try to reach as many people as possible. The advantage is that you can do this in a less time-consuming and resource-intensive way. But the disadvantage is that it will more likely result in a biased profile. The opposite is to choose for a small-scale campaign where you do targeted recruitment, where you tailor the whole project design to a specific target audience. The disadvantage, of course, is that it remains small scale, but the advantage is that you can reach a higher level of involvement. These are just two options, because, of course, during a citizen science project, you can also opt for hybrid forms where you combine the two elements together. Again, here in this phase, we offered some templates to the cities, and this is a canvas that we provided for co-creating the citizen science campaign in the cities. Moving on to the third phase, this is the live phase of your citizen science campaign. So you have taken all the necessary or preparatory activities, and now you launch the initiative. This is the phase where you recruit, communicate, and engage with your citizens. For this phase, we prepared several checklists and tips for the cities for engaging with youth, older adults, with women. There was also a checklist for organizing inclusive events. And also here, if you would like to access them, you can scan the QR code or click on the link. And then moving on to the final phase, which is the monitoring for inclusion phase. Although it's the last phase, we do recommend to take this already in consideration when you're starting with this approach. So for urban relief, it meant that we defined 2 evaluation criteria to evaluate the diversity in the sample. And it meant that along the way, we also monitored the socio-demographic profile of the citizens. So all 6 cities were requested to include a basic set of socio-demographic questions in the registration form or through the technology tools. And that is to ask about their gender, their age, and their highest levels of education, or for youth, the highest level of education of the mother and the father. All questions were designed in an inclusive way and made voluntary, so it was not obligatory for the participants to complete it. And we also explained them clearly what the research purpose was of collecting this type of data, besides the purpose of the citizen science campaign itself. These are some preliminary insights that we have for this phase in the project. This is the data that VUB is analyzing and receiving from the cities in an anonymous way. You can see that Kashket, Dundee, and Mannheim were able to reach a high number of participants, from 276 to 1,310. That all 3 of them achieved the gender KPI, so above the 50% threshold. But for the vulnerability KPI, which needs to be above 30%, we see that Dundee is slightly below the threshold, and that is because they mainly reached in their first campaign middle-aged participants. So for their second campaign, they now making a deviation or applying a mitigation strategy to include more younger age groups. The inclusivity target, we analyze it as such that it is a composite score of age and basic education, as explained on the bottom of the slide. Then I end with our next steps, or our dream, is to create a dashboard for our city so that they can have access in real time to this type of information, see how well they are performing in terms of diversities and their evaluation criteria, and take the necessary mitigation measures on the spot. With that, I also would like to end with 3 main recommendations. The first one is to align with your consortium partners conceptually about inclusivity, like we did, to reflect about what we mean with inclusive citizen science, on which specific target groups we are focusing, and what type of vulnerability you are focusing upon. Then the next conclusion is that you can use our blueprint also in other teams or contexts, as it offers you step-by-step guidance on how to do citizen science. You can use it across the whole project lifetime, but also for particular phases. And now in the final year of the project, because this information is now only available through a deliverable with lots of written information, we want to make it available through an interactive format where you can more easily find and download the templates. Then last, the monitoring for inclusion phase. I also would like to raise here some debate or critical awareness about this type of social inquiry, because you have to make a balance between doing social inquiry into demographic representation and having the proof that you actually reached a diverse audience, especially launching an open call to an open invitation or a large call to a large audience, versus balancing it with having a non-intrusive and privacy-friendly design. And with that, I thank you for your attention and happy to answer your questions at the end of the session.
Thank you very much, Carina. So now I'm very happy to present our next speaker, also a colleague of mine at VUB, Frans Ferdinand Rothe, working at the Digital Inclusion and Citizen Engagement Unit at Smith, focusing on digital inequalities, digital inclusion, and inclusive digital transformation. And he's going to share his experiences in the Engage SDG project.
Thank you, Flora. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know whether you see it. Okay. Perfect. Yeah, thank you. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm happy to reflect a little bit on the matter of leaving no one behind in our recent and ongoing Engage SDG project. Before I go into the project as such, I want to take a step back and reflect on leave no one behind and why for us inclusion, exclusion, leaving no one behind was so crucial. When UN launched the SDGs in 2015, they had an unprecedented focus on inequalities and on leaving no one behind. And while leave no one behind sounds like a very common slogan in development, it was actually new at that point. Before 2015, development agendas such as the Millennium Development Goals didn't focus on inequalities. There was nothing in there when it comes to reducing inequalities. And not only that, we actually saw that development often made inequalities worse. And before I talk about our project, I want to quickly talk about how that happened and why that happened, because it sounds a little bit counterintuitive. Well, development efforts often ended up making inequalities worse by leaving behind the most marginalized groups. I'm going to briefly illustrate this. If you think, for example, of the fight against poverty, we've seen in these decades leading up to the SDGs, a remarkable progress in getting people above the poverty line, which of course is laudable. But we also saw at the same time that the gap between those whose life improved and those that were most left behind increased. So these inequalities increased. Why that happened has to do with the fact that, of course, people are left behind because they are hardest to reach, especially in the context of development. Let's think about approaches that use posters to share information and raise awareness. You are missing out on those who cannot read or who cannot see. May seem trivial, but it is at the core of this increase of inequalities through development. You may set up vaccine tents somewhere. You are missing out on people with reduced mobility. You cannot move to these vaccine tents. Or you may organize a development project at a school. You will not reach those kids that don't go to school. So it is a very firmly embedded process of increasing inequalities to development, which is really important because we see that inequalities drive many of the challenges we face. Health to hunger, climate change, and growth. Inequalities are driving these problems. So if we want to achieve the SDGs, we must reduce inequalities. This is a little bit of a background of why leaving no one behind has become the central mantra of the SDGs, promoting development that reaches the most vulnerable and marginalized groups. Now, this requires that you include local communities, that you include vulnerable groups, that you understand local problems and barriers to inclusion for different groups in different local contexts, that you close certain data and knowledge gaps. Now, what does that mean for citizen engagement? Well, first of all, it means that citizen engagement and participatory approaches are actually fantastic opportunities and fantastic solutions to many of the core challenges. Many of the reasons of why we have been leaving people behind in development can fantastically be addressed through citizen engagement. You can close data inequalities when it comes to monitoring, for example. In many countries, especially, there's acute lack of data when it comes to SDG progress for vulnerable groups, for marginalized groups, for remote areas. Activities like citizen science, for example, are a great opportunity to close these data inequalities. Bridging knowledge gaps when it comes to implementation, to really make use of indigenous knowledge when you want to implement solutions, to capture the local needs, to build capacity along the way, to foster empowerment and ownership. Many of the challenges at the core of leaving the one behind are directly related to citizen engagement, and citizen engagement is a fantastic way forward. Now, that is one side of the story, but of course, as we've just seen in Karina's presentation, citizen engagement does not automatically mean inclusion. This is a fallacy that often people fall into when they say, well, we're going to tick the box of participation, and hence we will leave no one behind because we have participatory approaches. We know, of course, that citizen engagement faces the core challenges of leaving no one behind. Vulnerable groups tend to be excluded because they're often the hardest to reach. That goes for development at large, but of course it goes also concretely for citizen engagement. We're facing many of the same challenges. This includes basic literacy rates. How can you include groups with low literacy rates? especially with digital literacy, if these are the tools that you apply. Science literacy, time and availability, which groups are more likely to have the time to participate. We see language barriers, we see issues of trust and confidence, mobility and access, of course, social acceptance. All of these and beyond are factors that will limit the representation in your citizen engagement and will further reinforce this exclusion of the hardest to reach groups. This is where our project, the Erasmus Plus project, Engage SDG, came in. Core of this project was localizing inclusive participatory approaches in the Southern African development community. So we have partners in the Southern African region, and we have partners here in Europe, and we have co-developed solutions to localize participatory approaches in this region and have a strong focus on inclusion in this, especially knowing that, yes, these approaches are a great opportunity to create more inclusive development, but also realizing that we have to deal with these challenges that I just outlined. At the core of this project is the premise that no two approaches are the same. Choosing the most suitable participatory approach for your context means that you have to ask yourself a broad range of questions. Which approaches and which methods are appropriate in which context, for which purpose, and with which groups? If you want to select an approach or methodology, you have to think about your objectives. What is it you want to achieve? What kind of knowledge do you want to generate? What kind of knowledge do you want to generate specifically in the local context that you're in? What is the scope of your project? What are the resources? And of course, centrally, who are your participants and what are the local constraints that you are working with? And this is something that we see that often in, well, toolkits and guidebooks out there. There's a big global north focus when it comes to raising awareness of these potential constraints, and very little had been done in, for example, the Southern African context. So we took we placed a particularly key focus on the participants. Which approaches and methods can work for which participants? Not only the group size that shapes the suitability, but also participants' local resources and the constraints that matter. The need to understand power dynamics and local customs. So there's a broad range of questions you have to ask yourself before you start your project and before you choose your approach. These approaches and methods must be chosen and tailored to local realities. This is where we often see a big lack in the toolkits that tend to come from the global north. This can be relatively basic in saying, I understand that I'm working with a group with low literacy rates, so can I find alternative methods? Can I work with images, for example, with pictures instead of writing? A very basic example, but it showcases the flexibility that's needed in order to choose and organize the activities with an eye on making them as inclusive as possible. So we started from the assumption that you have to give people a way to maneuver and to navigate all these different decisions and selection criteria that will shape which approach and which method works and how we can localize it and tailor it to not only meet your objectives, but also make it available to a broad range of participants and make it work in the face of local constraints. So we developed a framework that should help people in navigating this process. The goal of this framework that we want to build, the integrated framework, was to build a dynamic directory to find the most suitable product, if you will. The mindset we had was, can we create a framework that works a bit like an online store? An online store where you can choose the criteria. You can say, okay, this is the amount of time and budget that I have. These are the local constraints I might be facing, electricity constraints, connectivity constraints. And here are other things I know about my context and the participants that would filter for you which methods and which approaches might work in your particular context. So with this mindset of having like an online store that gives you the most suitable product, we developed this integrated participatory framework, the so-called IPF, in which you can filter the approaches based on your needs and context, where you can learn more about different approaches, find examples of how it's been done in other cases, and find guidance, and learn about the pros and cons of different methods and explore examples from the field. In practice, this framework works exactly, if you will, in the logic of the store. You have a range of filters. They're relatively basic from the budget you have or the type of knowledge that you look for, and allows you to already filter by certain constraints that you know you might be facing. Literacy constraints, digital connectivity, electricity constraints. And filtering through these different key features of the context that you're working in, you can then find examples of concrete approaches, concrete methods that might work for your context, and then allows you to read through examples from the field to find other stories, success stories from different contexts and different localized versions of this method. So where we wanted to go with this, to have a guiding framework for applying participatory approaches to the SDG challenges and an integrated knowledge hub that works as a dynamic decision-making tool. Most specifically, we wanted to have this targeted to the SADC context, because many of these questions, again, are more related to global North context where the existing toolkits are developed, and questions, for example, around literacy or around connectivity are often not very much in the focus of these. Now, of course, this framework is only one part of the story. It allows you to filter, but it, of course, doesn't replace the multitude of conscious choices that you have to do in this process. Choosing the right method and the right approach is only one part of this process. How we already saw in Karina's presentation, you have to make these choices at a recruitment level, understanding your target audiences, and just identifying these vulnerable groups to begin with. You have to choose the tools that work best, that are accessible, and that work with this particular group that you might want to include. It has to do with communication, and not just when it comes to language, but how can you communicate in this particular context to make sure you reach the groups you want to reach. It has to do with the time and place. And here again, the local knowledge comes in. You cannot plan these without the local knowledge of saying what is a good time and a good place. What are social stigma around places? What are social stigma about groups participating in certain types of events in certain types of locations? And of course, it has to come back, like we just saw, on the level of evaluation. This being said, in the Engage SDG project, these are the next steps that we want to look at. For now, having developed this framework and having developed this toolbox where you can, first of all, be forced to ask yourself these questions, and where you can make these different local constraints and resource constraints an explicit part of your choice of method and your choice of approach, is already our first step to trying to structurally integrate the leave no one behind thinking in citizen engagement. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm very curious to hear your questions at the end of the other presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much from our behalf. And then last but certainly not least, we're very honored to have Margaret Gold here with us. Margaret is many things, but she is most of all, there is a researcher and the coordinator of the citizen science at the Center of Science and Technology Studies at the University of Leiden. But she is also the network coordinator for the Citizen Science NL, the Dutch Citizen Science Network. She does research. She does, as I said, a lot of things, but she's also involved in the City Ops project. And last year at the EXA conference, I was very impressed by the work she presented about the Leave No One Behind that was developed in this project. So that being said, I give the mic to you, Margaret.
Thank you so much, Flora, for this glowing introduction. One thing I'm not is I appear not to be in the list of presenters. I don't have an activated share button to share my slides with you. It's possible that I've entered using the general participants link rather than the presenters link. I'm going to see if that's indeed the case, in which case I might be popping out and returning. My apologies that I wasn't early to join the task. I don't know if you have the controls to activate that, Flora, from this interface.
Yes, I'm looking into it. I'm also looking at my colleague, Kate, who's supporting us technically. I'm not sure. No, I don't really. Oh, now I see you're at the presenters, in the presenters list. So now we could try.
Yes, it's activated. Brilliant. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for bearing with us, everybody. There you go. Thank you. So thank you for inviting me to join you. Sitting alongside our sister project, Urban Relief, who is in the same funding program as us for citizen observatories. And it's really lovely to follow your introduction, Frans Ferdinand, to the Leave No One Behind concepts, because that's at the heart of what we're doing in the City Obs project as well. And City Obs gets its name from the term citizen observatories, which is a specific subset of citizen science. And as Cardina's urban health and climate change and a sustainable city. And they have at their heart a number of different components, such as it can be using different types of sensor technologies or mobile phones or other tools to collect data around the environment. Doing this at a very place-based observation about what the local contextual factors are, but also with a desire to have an impact, so to be making decisions or actions towards improving the environment. So very much in keeping with the kinds of goals and targets that are described in the Sustainable Development Goals. And then in the project in City Obs, we're working with citizen observatories in this kind of a triangular shape, where there's a number of different pathways that are leading to what we hope to turn into a positive iterative cycle between data and insight gathering and by people that are in communities observing particular phenomena, and being able to analyze and draw information or insights or recommendations out of that data, and putting that in the hands of policymakers and decision makers, but then also getting the feedback loop to see if were interventions impactful, that they have the desired effect. And what we've been doing is working with a growing body of collaborators in this. We've started with 5 front-runner cities that have active citizen observatories already, and these were also embedded in the partnership. And we've been growing those with alliance cases, and now we're entering into a number of fellow cases, building up to 85 different. Instead of cities, we've actually morphed a little bit for that to be active citizen observatories that have their own tangible community or active communities. And we've been in conversation with them about the kinds of obstacles that they've been facing in practice. And it's one of our main aims to develop toolkits and resources for tackling those together, drawing on their experiences and supporting mutual learning across them. And we've been doing this across a number of topics. So this question tool, self-assessment tool that we've developed is in line with the areas of guidance documentation toolkits that we're developing for a total citizen observatory cookbook. Driven by the kinds of questions that people are facing within what they're trying to achieve. And in our particular case, we're looking at the topics of diversity and inclusion in the participation in these community-based investigations or citizen observatories. But we've really deliberately given that the framing of the Leave No One Behind pledge, which Frans Ferdinand has really introduced in a beautiful way about why this is important in what we're trying to achieve, also in the work of this branch of citizen science that aims towards improving the living environment on a number of these factors. So the Leave No One Behind toolkit actually takes that pledge to heart in what we're looking at. And we're in that magic phase of translating deliverable documents from a large process of insight gathering and finding out other things that people are doing in the field. So also looking at the beautiful stuff under development, the Urban Relief and other projects. We look forward to learning more about the Engage SDGs project as well. And we're turning this now into an online Leave No One Behind toolkit. And we're doing this within a Gitbook. So it's very much an iterative process where we'll continue to add and flesh out more and more resources as we find them and signpost them, and talking about why they're relevant, how they can be used, and where you can find other examples and case examples where they're relevant. And the structure that we're giving this is sort of roughly following the life cycle of any given project, but very much in an open iterative loop. So it can be entered at any time, and there can be a tighter iteration at any stage. But starting with a reflection on these types of on these types of concepts, and then entering into dialogue with partners, with community members, with other stakeholders. and then how to gain more insights into the local context and those of the participants. And I'm going to just introduce a few of them to you, because at the moment the Leave No One Behind toolkit has started mostly with workshop materials that enable this reflection and various levels of discussion. And we're starting to get much deeper into the signposting of other relevant resources. But what's right now in those workshop materials and in these reflection materials is a deeper dive into the Leave No One Behind concept and the Sustainable Development Goals. Where did this pledge to leave no one behind come from? And what are the factors behind it? So one of the interesting pieces of work that's been done by the UNDP is on understanding what are the factors that lead to people being left behind. And they've described 5 key factors. So discrimination, vulnerability to shocks, governance, socioeconomic status, and geography. So there's quite a lot of interface between these. So the way you see them coming together in this image really brings across the idea that the kinds of factors that people face are often multiple reinforcing factors as well. They're not single isolated issues. They often come paired and impacting each other as well. But to dive into a deeper understanding of these 5 factors and how they might be at play in the context of your own citizen observatory or citizen science activity is part of what the toolkit is about. And then in reflecting on what those factors might be in your own context, we also invite reflection on what you might be able to pick up in your own activities. With regard to the levers, which is also something that the UNDP has been doing work on, what kinds of positive levers can be brought to change those factors or to address those factors. And they boil down to examining, empowering, and enacting. And much as Franz Ferdinand also has described about the role that gathering data and insights as an examination activity and engaging citizens in that as an empowering activity are very much informative for how you can then go about designing interventions or actions or policies that bring people with them and in trying to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and redressing, not just preventing a bigger gap, but redressing existing gaps as well. So in these materials are a number of reflection techniques that you can bring into a conversation with either project initiator partners or stakeholder partners, or even with participating partners, such as asking yourselves who within this partnership should have the responsibility or should have a role in paying attention to being inclusive. So talking about where can we act, where our own ability to act. In the context of citizen observatories, we place it across this triangular positive cycle that we're trying to get going between researchers and science, which also includes data scientists at, for example, environmental institutes and other research-oriented roles or scientific processes-oriented roles, and citizens and communities and other stakeholder groups from the societal actors side. Together with policymakers and decision makers, and this could also be a broad definition of who can act on these topics. So it could be differing levels between the city municipality and the province and the national law, but it could also be industry. It could also be other actors that have a role to play in this. And these are the ways that we frame that the actors in this type of a triangle could play a role in considering who is left behind and what levers they have in their hands to remove these types of barriers. So in the toolkit, we focus primarily on reflection exercises on the concepts of leaving no one behind, but also other definitions of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, for example, the JEDI acronym. But we follow the 5 factors in how we present these. So if we talk about discrimination, for example, something as particularly in European funded projects is quite tempting to then take a kind of a checklist of all of these different types of demographic categories and just zoom in on, okay, have we got a number of different age ranges? Have we got good representation of gender? We pick apart these different pieces of demographic factors. And we look at, for example, who we have in the room, how diverse is our partnership, how diverse are the people that we're engaging with, But when you do this exercise, what we found in practice is that we tend to look at visual outside characteristics. So in this set of slides, if we ask about what's individual about this first child, people say it's a child, it's blonde, it's a boy. And then we introduce a new character and people say, oh, well, now we've got a dark-skinned boy. But we're judging by external characteristics, which is quite an easy way for us to be looking at diversity from a project point of view, or the way funding bodies drive us. It's still on gender and no other factors of diversity. This one drives me nuts. There's so many other components of diversity and inclusion. And of course, these things are all very connected, and it's about what you can see or not see. And what Leave No One Behind is really getting at is that all of these factors that might be invisible to us within our research institutions or within our projects. Quite a lovely example of Frans Ferdinand's with this poster on the wall. We think we've done a lovely job communicating. But I couldn't help notice that a lot of that poster was in English as well. So not only being literate, but being able to speak fluent English as well. And these are more than one thing that is at play for people. These things are very intersectional. So considering these types of intersectionalities is really quite complex. And if we examine these topics of equality and equity, for example, this is a classic example of equality. Everybody's got the same size box. Equity is you're adjusting to the differences in height, but you can go much further than that and say remove the barrier completely. So remove that fence and the need to be able to stand on something to see over it. And inclusion goes even a step further and say who's invited to play the game, who's invited to the ball game, who's invited to play as a participant in the sport. So it's getting much deeper into these concepts and what they actually mean in the context of your project. And I'll share a few more examples. The example of inequality, if you take another look at equity, you've still not addressed issues of justice. I'm going to flip through a few of these because it's in the work package deck. So it's not just the removal of barriers, but it's also the adjusting of the justice side of it. So in that fourth frame here in this picture, you see that not only have barriers been removed and ladders applied, but also correcting the distribution of the apples and correcting the bending of the tree. It's so many more factors to think about than we may find easy to do or be accustomed to do. One of our most successful exercises that we've been doing in a number of contexts where we've been running this as a workshop with colleagues in the field, reflecting on our own citizen science practices and the places where we're based, where we're doing these, is taking the geographic elements of what might be causing these kinds of factors that might leave people behind. And in the case of city obs, we've got a particularly strong focus on air quality and air quality monitoring. Amongst other types of environmental factors, this is the strongest one at the heart of what we're doing. So we might have a conversation with different air quality monitoring initiatives, community-based air quality monitoring initiatives. And start first by asking what kinds of things are you monitoring or measuring, or would you like to monitor more and like to measure? And just talk about what are these sources of air pollution? What is the type of particulate matter that we're talking about? And doing quite a literal mapping exercise with pens and paint and markers and highlighters with a big map of the city, and simply marking where do we know that these things are found. So this particular image is a air pollution map of the center of London, where you can see Marylebone Road going across the top, and it's known to be one of the worst air quality spots in the city of London. And this data is known. So there's quite a few things that we know about the data. But then we can start getting into conversation about what do we know about particular neighborhoods? Do we know that it's a higher income or a lower income neighborhood? Do we know that there's a highway cutting it off from the center of town? Do we know that it's poorly served by public transport? And you can start having conversations with each other about who is most impacted by these by air pollution in this example. So who's passing through these areas of high air pollution at those moments? And you can get into conversations of, well, it's commuters, it's people crossing the road and stood at a stoplight. it's school-age children walking to school. Now, what schools are here? Which age groups are walking through this area? And this can be another layer of mapping that you can do on top of the map, and you start to come up with this kind of overlay that Karina was also describing when she showed the map of Utrecht and things that are known about the demographics of Utrecht in terms of where lower income neighborhoods might be, and that this is a known proxy for where heat stress is. So you can also get into conversations just literally mapping these together and starting to get some contextual understanding of what else is happening in that actual physical place. And these are the main things I wanted to share with you from our own toolkit. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Wow, very, very, how an image can be so insightful. I learned a lot in so few minutes. So just as a reminder, again, please people, be so kind as to go to the questionnaire and fill in the quick questions.